I've got this one. If you could dine with any fictional character, who would it be and why?
I think this was a cop-out for me, but I think it would be your alien Jomny.
That's very sweet.
I wrote this story about this alien at a moment in my life when I was feeling particularly alien. I'd like to share every time I feel anxious about sending an email. When I sign my emails BEST, it's short for I am trying my best, which is short for please don't hate me, I promise I'm trying my best. Or my answer to the classic icebreaker, if I could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, I would. I am very lonely.
That was the first piece of yours that I've read, and his voice and his character is just so pure and full of wonder, which I think is something that's very missing in our world. And as you get older, you get more jaded, and that sense of wonder is something I still try to find within myself, and I think it'd be fun to take an alien out to dinner.
You're listening to PROX.
I think there's like a common idea about like when you work in film and TV, you like lose your integrity as a writer and like you kind of...
We're all sellouts.
Right, yeah. I personally do not think that's true because I feel like I've always been able to say like I understand the voice I'm nurturing and developing in terms of my own like ability and what I'm trying to do. And it feels like the benefit of having worked in writing books and having other forms of media to play with is that on the film and TV side, I get to nurture and grow my voice and my experience in working with other people in this specific goal.
You're listening to In Proximity. Jonny Sun is a film and TV writer, illustrator, and the New York Times bestselling author of Goodbye Again. You may also know him from an old website called Twitter, or I guess we should say X. That's where he gained over 500,000 followers, sharing thoughts and other musings as the character Jomny Sun, an alien trying to navigate life, love, and loneliness. In 2017, those tweets made him one of Time magazine's 25 most influential people on the internet, and Jonny adapted Jomny into his first illustrated novel, Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too. Jonny's work was noticed by fans and followers like Lin-Manuel Miranda and Raphael Bob Waxberg, which led to Turns illustrating Miranda's book, Good Morning, Good Night, Little Pep Talks for Me and You, and writing on Waxberg's groundbreaking animated TV series, BoJack Horseman. On this episode, Jonny sits with Proximity's head of film, Rebecca Cho, to get into the process of collaboration between writer and producer. They're currently developing an original animated project, which they'll talk a little bit about, along with how Jonny transitioned into writing from engineering, architecture, and a so-called Asian six-pack, and what makes great writers, directors, and creatives. Here's a hint. You're doing it right now.
Welcome, Jonny Sun, to In Proximity. We're going to start our conversation off with the Get Real segment. To your left, you will see 3 camera reels, which will have questions in it for us to answer. So if you can open them one at a time, we'll go through and answer them.
Awesome. All right. If you could dine with any fictional character, who would it be and why? Ooh. Spike Jonze's Where the Wild Things Are continues to just stick with me. And I want to dine with the main wild thing. I think it's the one voiced by James Gandolfini. But there's something about like that character as done in the film that is so mature and childlike at the same time and kind of like unknown. And I guess in the movie you see him purely through Max's eyes. And so he operates as like this enigma, this like emotional black hole question mark. And so I think part of me just wants to like get another perspective on that character in a restaurant and not out in the wild.
Totally. That's a great answer. I think this was a cop-out for me, but I think it would be your alien Jomny.
It's very sweet.
No, but I just in thinking about it rapid fire style, I think that was the first piece of yours that I've read, and his voice and his character is just so pure and full of wonder, which I think is something that's very missing in our world. And as you get older, you get more jaded. And that sense of wonder is something I still try to find within myself. And I think it'd be fun to take an alien out to dinner.
You'd just be like, what's that?
Yeah.
What do I do with this?
Talking to every ingredient on the plate.
Yeah. Ooh, orange.
I love that.
All right, let's do the next question. Here we go. 7 years later, what are your thoughts? Oh, this is a tweet of mine in which I made this poll with a serious question. The 3 monkey emojis with like mouth, you see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. My question was, is it one monkey making 3 faces or is it 3 different monkeys?
Ooh.
This was very contentious for a very long time. It was like 50-50 forever. But it
Did
broke.
it tip over?
Yeah, it tipped over. So the winning answer was one monkey making 3 faces.
Wow,
53%,
really?
which I disagree with.
I disagree with that too.
I think it represents that nobody knows what speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil means.
I immediately felt it was 3 different monkeys.
Yes. I also am like telling on myself because 1, I probably said the order of that wrong. And 2, I don't actually know where that came from, but in my head,
Sure.
maybe I made up a myth for myself where it's 3 different monkeys.
I just think it's 3 different monkeys because you can put all 3 on the same page.
Uh-huh.
But I think you're right. I think that saying sort of implies 3 different situations versus one situation for all 3.
Yeah. It's harder to construct a fable where there's one character who's doing all 3
does
of
not
those.
Speak, does not see, and does not hear.
Yeah.
All right, last question.
Okay. Ooh, this is the big one.
This is the big one.
All right. Sharing your personal life on social media, yes/no, and why? Ooh.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know your thoughts because I think you've shared
Mhm.
a lot of your personal life previously and maybe less so now. You started on social media with a personality and it sort of transitioned into yourself now. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to know sort of what guides you for that.
I mean, I feel conflicted
Mhm.
about it because, I mean, you're right. I did get like my start as a writer through Twitter and through social media, but I've
Mhm.
always felt like I was engaging with it less as like a direct, here's me sharing my personal life, and more of like here is a filtered version of the stuff that I'm worried about or interested in or want to talk about. And I think there's a difference. Very early on, I turned to Twitter and turned to this like character that I created of this alien as a way to like process certain feelings that I couldn't articulate in any other way, or to find other people who might share these feelings of like anxiety and depression
Mhm.
that I had not had the courage to perhaps speak to people in person about. There was an element of me saying like, oh, I'm writing something or I'm creating something that let it feel more like a bit like a creative project as opposed to like a direct
Mhm.
sharing. But then I think like the more I talk about that, the more I'm like, is all creative work and is all art in some ways a parsing of personal experience or just a way to try to process?
I think so. I think art making is part of human life. I think there's so much value in the creative process explicitly in the industry we work in, but also I think part of everybody's daily life is processing and parsing out our own emotions and sharing that
Right.
and connecting with people. And as someone who's not very present on social media, that doesn't negate the fact that I see incredible value in it and how it connects people. Obviously, I think that is what grew Jomny's audience too. It's like it immediately connected with so many people. And, I think there's something really special about that.
Yeah, totally. To me, it feels like art is sort of like a community making device or project. It did feel like that's what I guess like the Jomny idea was all about. And it definitely was something that I was doing it very much for myself in like searching for connection and community and people who would be able to understand the scary things that I was feeling.
let's talk about how we met. I can't even remember how long ago it was, but
It's been a while.
I know, it's been a while. I can tell you how I learned of you and
Okay.
why I reached out and asked for a meeting with you. So when I was working at Warner Brothers, the head of the studio at the time sent your New York Times profile to the whole staff and said, "This guy sounds interesting. We should find out what he's up to." And that email got disseminated to everyone. I read the profile. I agreed with him. You sounded very interesting. Did a
Very
little
kind.
perusing on your Twitter. And then I think I just reached out at that time to your agent or your manager. I can't remember who. And it was right after I had gotten promoted. So it was very early in my career as an executive. And I think you were probably one of my first few general meetings.
I think I was in LA for the book talk for Everyone's an Alien.
Yeah.
And I was only in LA for like 3 days. And it was kind of like, oh man, this cool person from Warner Brothers wants to meet me.
That's crazy.
That's
I
awesome.
love that. And then I think we went to dinner the next time you were in LA and we had tried to develop a couple things. And obviously now we meet again as a producer and writer, which, you know,
Yeah.
6 years later.
I know. Look at
Wow.
us.
Look at us. We've
That's
grown
great.
up. Let's talk about how you got started with writing, because I think when I met you, you were still in your PhD program
Yeah.
in architecture. That's what you were finishing. You had just published your first book, Everyone's an Alien, which was also a book you illustrated. And so you were really wearing many hats at the time. And I think it was before you had ever written for television or
TV.
film.
Yeah, that's right. So that book was Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too. That felt like the culmination of a years-long project that started on Twitter. Like I wanted to basically do Shel Silverstein, but a bit more long form than any Shel Silverstein book, and do what Shel does with emotions and like kind of talking about these deep, scary feelings in a long way.
Following in the tradition of a lot of writer illustrators who write things that feel very approachable on the surface, but maybe explores something deeper and has layers to it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think like I've always, even as a adult, I've loved those types of books. And that was the idea, to like just create something that felt like that, but that you could live in for just a little bit longer. Before that, I had written some plays in college and had been doing comedy and improv and sketch and stuff. But when I started architecture school, for anyone who hasn't been to architecture school, it is truly a grueling, all-consuming thing. And I had this idea that I was like, oh yeah, I'll start my architecture school experience and I'll also write plays on the side and I'll get to continue what I was doing in college. But I found out there was no time. There was just simply no time or bandwidth. And so I started just finding like the creative outlet through Twitter and just being able to be like, okay, I can like spend 5 minutes to compose a single idea. And that was as much kind of creative expression I could get in my week sometimes.
In the thick of architecture school,
exactly.
you had 5 minutes to yourself to be creative.
Exactly. And then it was only after that I started my PhD at MIT in essentially like a media studies, like the idea of like the internet as the city and how internet affects society and how technology affects culture. But it was there that I had a little more breathing time, or maybe fought for a little more breathing time for myself, where like I looked back on all that stuff that I was writing and I thought like, I really want to make this into like a more cohesive project. And so that book came out of that. And it also came out of this like idea that in grad school I was incredibly depressed and lonely and felt like it was a pretty bleak period of my life. I had started my PhD in the fall of 2015. And so basically the first year of like struggling to get through this PhD was when I was like, screw it. I'm gonna do the thing I always dreamed of and the thing I actually care about, which is like work on this book that I've been wanting to work on for years. And so working on that book was like a piece of joy that I was trying to build for myself. That book came out in 2017. And it was through that, yeah, like you said, that I met you. It was through that book that the creator of BoJack Horseman, Raphael Bob Waxberg, had read it. And that was the reason he hired me to write for season 6. That was the thing that kind of pulled me out of school. That was the thing that it was like, oh, okay, my whole life I've been waiting for like the call Like I feel like every single time I worked on something creative, I was like buying a lottery ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the first time where it was like, oh, that lottery ticket is like, I can't
It
not
felt
do
like
this.
a fork in the road where you had to sort of explore
Yeah,
this other path.
yeah, exactly.
Was writing for you always sort of a creative outlet that you had, even despite pursuing architecture and a PhD and things that seem sort of antithetical to a writing career that you have now, or not
Yeah.
necessarily the most traditional pathway, I guess, to a writing career?
Yeah.
Was that just something you always did? Is that something you always harnessed? I'm curious.
When I was a kid, I would just go off and write these little stories to myself that I never showed anyone. And in high school, I was in a band for a little bit, but like I was most excited about writing songs. And I eventually started writing songs that like I was trying to get my friends to like play because it turns out the writing thing was the thing that I
Sort
cared
of
most
connected
about.
all the way through
Yeah.
sort of your early
Yeah.
childhood, even into your adulthood.
Yeah, and it was always an escape because I think, I mean, speaking as two Asians, I feel like in high school I was pushed into the like, our high school in Canada had this term called the Asian six-pack in high school, which was the 3 types of math courses you could take and the 3 types of science courses you could, I think it was like
Incredible.
biochem physics and calculus, geometry, and linear algebra or something. It just felt like all my other Asian friends were doing that, and I was also doing that because
It's sort of what you were expected to do.
Yeah, and like I don't want to paint myself into that like corner of like I rejected that, because the truth is I also was fascinated by that stuff.
Yeah.
It's why I like went to college for engineering. But there was a part of me that was like, there's something missing in that. The ability to express and do creative work was something that like I had never thought of it. I mean, this is partially maybe growing up Asian Canadian. I never thought that I could have a life as a creative, that I could never like make it as a creative professional. And so the concession is that, okay, I'll do it as a hobby, or I'll do it when I have free time and it'll just be for me and it'll just be for my friends. And honestly, like there's a life where like that is all I do creatively and it is just as fulfilling. But that was a case where looking back on it now, it's like, oh, I was doing all that stuff because that was the thing I was most passionate about.
Yeah. And I think sometimes there's this like false binary between like the math and sciences and the creative things that we do and the creative arts that we pursue. And I think the older I get and the more sort of you learn about the creative process, sort of learn about the way the world works, it is more intertwined and more compatible with each other than I think you think when you're 14 and you're made to do the Asian six-pack.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is like, it does feel like in a way it's all problem solving.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's all like you have all these different variables that you know you have to play with. And like in our industry, it's sort of like you have these different kind of requirements that you have to satisfy and different people's kind of input that you want to include. And so it becomes like this impossible math problem that is so satisfying to.
And I think
to work through.
oftentimes you have like a hypothesis of like how you want the story to be or what you want it to convey. And then I think sometimes it surprises you as you're working through a creative problem that like maybe that was the wrong idea, that maybe we need to switch that idea and try something different.
Do you think that there's like a level of self-awareness or like self-reflection required in order to be a creative? That's such a leading question because I'm just, for me, the answer is yes. And I know the answer for you is yes. But like, I'm more just like, could you talk about that?
Yeah, just what self-reflection contributes to the process.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's so hard to have self-reflection when you're in the creative process because it is a very grueling process, right? Like there's so much fun in it, but that said, it is still real work and it is very grueling to have to like pick something apart or have other people pick it apart and really hear that feedback too.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really hard to have self-reflection while you're in that process. But I do think it's so necessary to have that distance to, and this isn't always possible in the sort of capitalistic version of
the fast-paced
the artistic pursuits.
Yeah.
But in the project we're working on together, which is an original idea that we are developing, I actually think the strike and being able to put it down for the 5.5 months that we had, it just opened up some possibilities and like answered some questions or brought up some new questions that we probably wouldn't have had a chance to address had we just been trying to jam through it. I think it taught me a really valuable lesson in being able to generate that space for the artists that I work with.
First of all, I really do appreciate in us working together how you are creating that space and like the generosity that you have in terms of creating space and in just collaborating together. And I think the other part of that is, what was the other part of it? I got so emotional that I was like, I love working with you.
I think the question for me is like, how do you create that space for yourself? How do you practice that generosity for yourself, right? I think for me, it's easier because I'm not the one that has to. I always say this about being an executive and a producer. It's like, it's not my creative voice that's on the line. It's not my creative ideas that's on the line. One way someone's sort of described my job to me before, back when I was an intern, is like, you're just creating the launching pad, but the artist is responsible for creating the rocket that gets launched out into the world. So for me, it's a little bit easier I think, to practice grace and to practice that generosity. But I'm curious for you, like how you practice that for yourself, how you create space for self-reflection in your writing process.
Sometimes I feel like it gets to a point of panic where like there is no room for self-reflection, and it gets to that idea of acting out of instinct more than out of something that your conscious brain can fully understand or articulate. But I think like that's also any creative work is trying to figure out something that the rest of your brain can't articulate anyway. But you're right. I think when you're in it, it's so much harder to like be able to step outside and fully see what you're doing. So maybe like the gift is time.
Totally.
The ability to do that.
Time heals all wounds. Let's talk about collaboration in film and TV. For you, is that process of collaboration a way for you to be able to hone your voice and your skills? Have you found it at certain points detrimental to that process, or has it always been sort of like a fulfilling journey? I'm curious.
The way I'm trying to see it is it all feels like a learning process, and it all feels like more data points that you can draw from for the next thing. The other thing that strikes me as so interesting and like creates that impossible math problem is that everyone is working on the same thing, but the thing that they're focused on is slightly different. Like everyone wants to make an exciting, emotional movie, for example.
But the lens that they look at it through is slightly different.
Right, yeah. And I think that's what's really exciting, because sometimes I get exec notes and like I'll get notes from you that kind of blow my mind in a way of like, I was so interested or like focused on this part of it that like I forgot about this other part of it. And like having all those different perspectives kind of at play is very cool. I think there's like a common idea about like when you work in film and TV, you like lose your integrity as a writer, and like you kind of...
We're all sellouts.
Right, yeah. I personally do not think that's true, because I feel like I've always been able to say like, I understand the voice I'm nurturing and developing in terms of my own like ability and what I'm trying to do. And it feels like the benefit of having worked in writing books and having other forms of media to play with is that like, on the film and TV side, I get to nurture and grow my voice and my experience in working with other people in this specific goal. And then in writing, like my next book, for example, that I'm working on, I get to take stuff that excited me and that I learned from kind of solving those problems in film and TV and like seeing what translates and what doesn't. And thinking about, okay, does a like traditional, conventional 3-act structure of a screenplay of like a big 4-quadrant movie translate to like a weird science fiction story that I'm writing? And in what ways does it? And in what ways can I learn from that? And is it surprising?
Yeah, that's a very like healthy way to look at how your voice gets filtered through the voice of the director or the showrunner and gets filtered through all these different aspects in the process of making a show and making a movie. So I think having a perspective of it's still in there, but it isn't all mine. And then being able to take things that you learn from that process and put it into something that might preserve it more.
I realize now as I'm talking, I'm like coming in with like a bias of a writer, of like someone who's like almost there's an expectation that their voice comes through.
Sure.
Do you feel like there's an expectation or a non-expectation for your voice to be in it? And like as an exec and as a producer, to what extent do you feel like you're shaping the collective voice?
Yeah. I think for me, the expectation isn't necessarily for my voice to come through. It's always being able to work with people who I share a common idea, or even if I don't share that voice, I gravitate towards it and sort of find something special within it and be able to hone that and being able to help bring that out in the final product is sort of how I see my role, and not necessarily infusing my personal voice or my personal ideas into that process. Of course, I think it naturally does get infused just by the nature of how collaborative and how in-depth you work with certain people. But I don't know, I don't necessarily like expect to see my voice be a part of it or be represented in the final product. I think I do expect the final product to be representative of the initial idea or the initial voice or the initial creative spark that made me excited and made me think there's something special here that the world needs to see, or that this will resonate with. If it resonates with me, I'm sure it will resonate with more than just me, that there are other people out there who feel the same way or have had the same thoughts but never seen it articulated in this specific way, which I think for me, growing up as an audience, like that was what was so exciting, to be able to read something or watch something and be like, I had that same thought and I didn't know how to articulate it, and this person just did, and it made me feel, less alone in the world. And I think that's really exciting to be able to be a part of the process of bringing that out.
Yeah, I really resonate with that because I feel like there's the like creatives I look up to the most are people who are just really good listeners and really good noticers of things. Just finding and like noticing what's interesting and like what's emotional.
I think that's a really underrated skill in this industry, especially being able to notice things and being able to listen. And I think this is also like the way the industry is sort of externally portrayed, right? Like it's a lot of people talking, a lot of flashiness. I think there's a very real sense of auteur theory where people attribute a final product to this one person's genius, and it all sort of sprung from their mind and all of that thing. But I think the people who are able to help shape it and make it good and also do it themselves are actually great listeners and great noticers, and being able to recognize patterns and rhythms in the world, right? And being able to recognize that in a story or in a character. I think the greatest writers and directors are actually secretly the best listeners and observers of the world, and not the tortured artist talking, being the loudest voice in the room.
This is so funny that this is the first thought that comes up, because in the project I'm about to talk about, I was not the writer. I was the illustrator. But in working with Lin-Manuel Miranda on our book that he wrote and I illustrated called Good Morning, Good Night, it was this like really cool process, because the original idea was that, Lin has for a period of time was tweeting good morning and good nights, just like things that he would take like a bit of time from his day to think about and kind of put them together. And when we started talking about doing a book together, I truly had thought that it was just going to be like, all right, here's a bunch of text. Just like, now go off and like draw it, right? Draw what you think. But there was so much of that process, and Lin was so generous in us working together. I think at some point, either I had thought of this or we had both kind of talked about doing this, but like we just sat down for like a number of days and went through every single good morning, good night piece of text in the book. And I basically just sat down and I said, do you remember where you were when you wrote this? Do you remember what was going through your head? Do you remember if it was a bit vague? Do you remember exactly what it was about? And there are so many times where like the way he answered was so shocking and like mind-blowing and eye-opening for me. There was one passage that was about like knowing when it's time to move on from something, or like the feeling of like having to move on from something. And I was so stumped for so long about like what to draw
How do you
for
draw that? Yeah.
And I asked him, and he said that he had written that around the period In the Heights, his first musical on Broadway, was ending, or that he was thinking about leaving or something like that. And we were talking about In the Heights, and there's such a like visual motif of the fire escape and kind of like that platform that you can stand on for a while, but eventually you have to go up or down those stairs. And I was like, that's it. That's how you draw that there's a platform and there's stairs going up or down that lead to other fire escapes. Like without like being able to like know someone and without being able to like talk about it, I don't know what I would have drawn. I would have drawn something way less interesting and specific. And so like that project, I mean, every page was like that, where for me, the idea as the illustrator was, I'm going to create a portrait of this person, of my friend who I know, in 50 drawings, and none of them are going to be of his face, but they're all going to be about a specific detail or a specific way that he's thought of something. And I think in a way, I take that idea in everything else that we're doing. So like, yeah, in the project that we're working on, it's sort of like, here's a portrait of us. Here's a portrait of Rebecca and the types of endings she likes, or the types of like emotional parts that I am starting to learn excite her.
Totally. I was just going to talk about our project because I think this is a really good example of how a creative collaboration can begin. It's an original idea for an animated movie based on like a historical fact with a lot of creative liberties taken about what history looked like. I think when I started at Proximity, I had called you just to catch up. And I think I'd brought up the article of like, isn't it so crazy that, you know, thousands of years in the future, there's a fossil that was found that just totally, you know, stumps the scientific community, and that like there's a story behind it, a mystery behind it that we'll never know. And it sort of just sparked the idea for us to try to figure out a story that will explain this mystery that will honestly never be explained, right? Like in the scientific sense. Then we started sort of talking about like the emotions that this image of this fossil evoked for us, right? Like the idea of like what could be uncovered behind this if you were there and if you saw how this happened. And I think that's how the project we're working on sort of like evolved and became what it is. And I think you actually brought a piece of Jomny into it too. And this project actually really feels like a culmination of like everything we've been talking about for 6 years, like romantic comedies and endings that are on the surface sad, but also full of hope, things that have a sense of humor, things that sort of uncover scientific mysteries, like all of these things that I think we've just been talking about for 6 years and like gravitating towards. Like this felt like the right thing where, oh, we could explore all of those things and do it in a way that excites both of us and maybe could be exciting for the rest of the world too.
Totally. Yeah. It is so cool to like think about just like how much time goes into anything.
The other thing that I sort of feel like about the creative process from the executive side is I have to listen to the writer and the director, because the version of the movie that they're telling me that they want to make sort of never really changes, right? It can grow, it can sort of morph, it can sort of evolve, but I think the like heart of it doesn't really ever change. And if you disagree on the heart of that thing, then I think that's where there's always conflict and there's sort of like a really contentious process. So for me, like really getting to know someone and like listening to what they tell me is like the heart of the story that they want to tell, or the reason they want to tell this story is really important. And I think even with this project that we're working on, like the first thing that you asked me was like, is it okay if it has kind of a sad ending? It's like, are we okay to explore these big themes that are not supposed to be in movies like this? And I think it was like a moment of me being like, yes, that's exactly what we want to do, right?
And I really appreciate that, like, because I think like on my side, I think so much of my process as a writer is figuring out in a weird way like what I'm allowed to do in anything. And like It's also just so gratifying to be working with you because I think a lot of that initial call about this project after you'd sent me that article was so much of like, here's why I find this so like sad and like exciting, but there's also like a heartbreaking element of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more just like, I don't think we're allowed to do this. And for you to be like, no, we're allowed to do this. That's the reason we're doing this.
Yeah.
It's like so freeing and like
Yeah.
to create that space to
Totally.
explore that is awesome.
Prox Recs. Prox Recs.
So the way we end our podcast is with Prox Recs, recommendations for our audience. And I think to relate back to the theme of our talk, maybe it can be something about something that has helped you become a better writer, but also it could be anything you want it to be.
Yeah.
And it can be multiple things, I guess, too.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is this book that I feel like has opened my eyes in so many ways to the creative process. It's by the playwright Sarah Ruhl, and it's called 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write, and then subtitle, On Umbrellas and Sword Fights, Parades and Dogs, Fire Alarms, Children, and Theater. And I had read this book when I was searching for, like, in the idea of permission giving. When I thought about writing my second book, which was Goodbye Again, I thought about this idea of like writing a collection of short personal essays, but I really wanted the emphasis to be on short. Like I didn't want anything to be more than 5 pages, or if there were a few longer pieces, that they would be few and far between, and that most of them would be these short pieces that sort of existed together as like a cloud. And they all, as you read them, you got this feeling of there was an emotional arc to them, but there was no literal arc to them, that you kind of felt your emotions being like moved in a specific way, and that these ideas all kind of like started to link together or speak to each other. It was all like a very kind of theoretical idea. And so I was searching for like essay collections that did this kind of thing. The other one that I had really affected me was, well, there were 2 other ones. Ross Gay's The Book of Delights and Sarah Manguso's book, Ongoingness, The End of a Diary. But this book by Sarah Ruhl, I think was fascinating because it's both like a book that does all that stuff, but it's also a book about art and creativity. Like I think she says it in the foreword, it is truly like a bunch of essays that she wanted to have more time to do. And so it's a theater theory book in a way. But because they're so short and because they just get to like the thesis of it, it also becomes this like thing I keep going back to because of how impactful and emotional every piece is.
Mine is also a book, and I'm sort of cheating because I'm still making my way through it. But it's a book I'm reading right now called Visual Intelligence by Amy E. Herman. It's called Sharpen Your Perception, Change Your Life. I believe she's an art historian. It's a book that really talks about observation and the power of observation, especially visual observation, and how to use that to understand our world, which I think is something we talked a lot about today too. And I think it impacts the stuff you write or the stuff you respond to as well, to be observant of the world around us. Thank you, Jonny, so much for being here and having this conversation with me. It was such a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you so much. This is such a treat and an honor.
In Proximity is a production of Proximity Media. If you like the show, help us spread the word. Send a link to your friends and loved ones. Follow, rate, and review In Proximity on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And follow us on social media. We are at Proximity Media on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. To learn more about us and read episode transcripts, head to proximitymedia.com. In Proximity executive producers are Ryan Coogler, Zinzi Coogler, Ohanian, and Paola Mardo. That's me. Our theme song and additional music is composed by Ludwig Göransson. Caitlin Plummer is our producer. Celine Mendiola is our associate producer. Our editors are Cedric Wilson and Judybelle Camangyan. Ken Nana is our sound designer and mix engineer. Isabella Miller is our production assistant. Alexandria Santana is our social media coordinator. Special thanks to all the other folks who helped make this show possible, the whole Proximity Media team, and to you, for listening to In Proximity.
I feel like living in LA is sort of like living like a Hogwarts experience almost, where like magic is right underneath your nose.
Yeah.
Like I say this all the time, but the Gelsons in Silver Lake, that used to be the first Walt Disney animation
Really?
house. Like, and now it's a Gelson's.